My best friend sat on my hospital bed after I gave birth and said, "I've been keeping your husband's company at night while you were too pregnant to function." She was holding my newborn daughter while my husband, Tom, stood frozen by the door with the coffee he'd just gotten from the cafeteria. "What do you mean by keeping him company?" I was still hooked up to the IV barely 12 hours after my emergency C-section, and Jessica was sitting there smiling like she'd done something wonderful. "Oh, don't look so worried. I just mean I've been helping him with his needs. You know men can't go 3 months without intimacy. You stopped being available when you hit 7 months and the doctor said no physical activity." She adjusted my daughter's blanket like she was the mother. "Someone had to take care of him." Tom dropped the coffee and it splattered across the hospital floor. "Jessica, what the hell are you talking about? I haven't seen you in months." His voice was angry and I noticed Jessica's smile falter. "Tom, don't play dumb. Tell her about Tuesday nights when you said you were at basketball. Tell her about the lunches at my apartment. Tell her about last week when you cried in my bed about how scared you were of becoming a father." She said it all while examining her manicure, but her voice was getting desperate. "You're insane. I was at basketball with my brother. He's right here." Tom pointed at his brother walking in. "Jake, tell them where I've been every Tuesday." Jake looked confused. "At the gym with me and the guys." "What's going on?" Jessica's face went red. "No, you were with me. Look, I have photos." She pulled out her phone and started scrolling frantically. "This is Tom on my couch." She showed a photo of someone from behind who could have been anyone. "That's not me. That's literally just some random guy's back." Tom walked over to me and took my hand. "Amy, I swear I don't know what she's talking about." Jessica stood up shaking. "Stop lying. You came to me. You said Amy got fat and boring. You said you missed having a real woman." My mother-in-law Linda walked in with balloons and stopped when she saw everyone's faces. "What's happening?" Tom turned to her. "Jessica is having some kind of breakdown. She's claiming we had an affair." Linda laughed. "That's impossible. Tom's been with me and Robert every Tuesday helping renovate our garage, and Thursday he does virtual therapy for his anxiety about becoming a father. I drove him to his first appointment." Jessica's lies were falling apart. "No, that's not true. He told me he wished Amy had gotten an abortion." Tom's face went dark. "I've wanted this baby since day one. We tried for 2 years. Everyone here knows that." Jessica pulled out more photos. "These are from my security camera, Tom's car at my apartment." Tom looked at the photos. "That's a silver Honda. I drive a black Toyota. Are you seriously this desperate?" The nurse called security while Jessica kept spiraling. "You texted me. Look at these messages." She showed her phone, but Tom pulled out his. "Here's every text between us. The last one was 8 months ago when you asked for Amy's birthday. Nothing since because Amy told me you were being weird about the pregnancy." I finally understood. "You've been fantasizing about this. None of it happened." Jessica turned on me. "It did happen. He loves me. He said marrying you was a mistake. He said I was prettier and funnier and better in bed." Tom's brother Jake stepped forward. "Jessica, you need help. Tom shows us videos of Amy every day. He bought 3 pregnancy books. He cried at the ultrasound. Whatever you thought was happening only existed in your head." Jessica looked around the room desperately. "I have proof. I bought lingerie for him. $3,000 worth." Linda shook her head. "Sweetheart, buying yourself lingerie doesn't mean you had an affair." Jessica started screaming. "He promised me. He said after the baby came, he'd leave her. He said I'd be a better mother. He said our kids would be prettier because I'm blonde." Tom looked disgusted. "I've literally never been alone with you. Ever. Amy made it clear she was uncomfortable with our friendship, so I cut you off completely. That was 8 months ago." Jessica tried to run to the bassinet, but the nurse blocked her. "That should be my baby. I earned it. I manifested it. I've been preparing for 3 months. I bought a crib." She kept screaming. "Check his phone. Check for dating apps. I deleted them to save your marriage, Amy. You owe me. I protected you from the truth that he doesn't love you." Tom pulled out his phone and handed it to me. "Check everything. Messages, apps, photos, emails. Jessica is sick, and nothing she said is true." His brother Jake spoke up, and what he said made my blood run cold. Jake's face went white, and he looked at Tom with something close to fear before he turned back to me. He took a long breath, and the words came out slow. "Jessica got sent to a hospital 2 years back for doing this same thing with his college roommate's boyfriend. She told everyone they were together in secret when the guy had never even been alone with her. The room went totally quiet except for the beeping machines. Jessica's hands were still on my baby, and I felt sick watching her fingers touch my daughter's blanket. Two security guards walked through the door, and Jessica's head snapped toward them. She started yelling that we were all lying to save Tom's reputation. Her voice got louder and higher. She pulled my daughter against her chest and held on so tight the baby started crying. The nurse moved fast and grabbed the baby's body while Jessica screamed. She kept saying the baby was hers, that she had rights as the real mother. The nurse had to pry Jessica's fingers off one by one while Jessica sobbed and reached for my daughter. The guards took Jessica by both arms, and she kept screaming as they pulled her toward the door. She looked back at me with tears running down her face and said I was stealing her family. The door closed and the room felt too quiet. My whole body started shaking and I couldn't make it stop. The monitor started beeping faster and louder. Tom grabbed my hand, but I was shaking too hard to hold on. The nurse came over and lifted my hospital gown to check the incision site. She pressed on my stomach and I saw her face change. There was blood seeping through the bandage. Tom kept saying he was sorry over and over. His voice was breaking. I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but I couldn't get words out. The nurse called for another nurse and they started checking all the monitors and writing things down. Jake stood by the wall looking lost. Linda came closer to the bed and put her hand on my shoulder. The nurse said my blood pressure was too high and the stress was making me bleed more than normal. She said I needed to stay calm, or I might have to go back to surgery. Tom's hand was squeezing mine so tight it hurt, but I didn't tell him to stop. Jake moved closer to the bed once the nurse finished checking everything. He looked at Tom and then at me and started talking. His roommate's girlfriend had to get a restraining order against Jessica after she showed up at their apartment holding baby clothes. Jessica told the girlfriend she was pregnant with the roommate's baby, even though they'd never touched each other. The girlfriend was so scared she moved out of state. Jessica got sent to a psychiatric hospital for 3 weeks. Her family moved her across the state after she got out. That's how she ended up in our city. That's how she found me again and acted like we were still best friends. Jake said he should have warned us when Jessica first showed up, but he didn't think she'd do it again. He thought she was better. His voice got quiet at the end. My brain was putting pieces together and I didn't like what I was seeing. Jessica moved here 8 months ago. I would have been 2 months pregnant then. She told me she got a great job offer and wanted to be closer to old friends. I was so happy to have her back. I never asked about the job. I never saw her go to work. She was always available when I needed help with baby stuff. She came to doctor appointments. She helped me pick out the crib. She was there for everything. There was never any job. She moved here to be near me while I was pregnant. She planned this whole thing. She waited until I was vulnerable and inserted herself into my life. I felt Tom's hand shaking in mine. Linda sat down in the chair next to the bed and her face looked older than it did an hour ago. Tom pulled out his phone with his free hand and called the police. He told them what happened and where we were. He used words like stalking and delusion and threat. The nurse came back in and started checking my vitals again. She wrote more things on the chart. She told me I needed to stay as calm as possible. My incision was bleeding more than it should. She adjusted my IV and added something to it that she said would help with the pain and stress. Everything felt fuzzy at the edges. Tom was still on the phone giving details to whoever was on the other end. Jake sat down on the other side of the room. Linda held my other hand. A detective showed up less than an hour later. His badge said Raymond Stevenson. He had a notebook and he talked to everyone who saw what happened. He asked me questions about Jessica. He asked Tom about their relationship or lack of one. He asked Jake about the college incident. He wrote everything down. He treated this like a real crime instead of a fight between friends. He used the word stalking multiple times. He said he'd seen cases like this before where someone builds a whole fantasy relationship that never existed. The detective asked if Jessica had ever been to our house. My stomach dropped so fast I thought I might throw up. She helped me set up the nursery last month. She was in my house. She touched all the baby things. She was in the room where my daughter would sleep. She saw where we kept everything. She probably imagined herself living there. She probably imagined putting my baby to bed in that room. The detective wrote that down. He asked if she had a key. I nodded. Tom's face went hard. The detective said he needed to check our house. He needed to see if Jessica left anything or took anything. He needed to photograph the nursery. Tom stood up and said he'd go with him right now. Linda said she'd stay with me. Tom kissed my forehead and told me he'd be back soon. He left with the detective and Jake went with them. The room felt too big with just me and Linda. She pulled the chair closer and held my hand with both of hers. She didn't say anything and I was glad. I couldn't handle hearing that everything would be okay. I was scared about what they'd find at the house. I was scared Jessica had cameras set up. I was scared she'd been in our bedroom. I was scared she'd been watching us. Linda smoothed my hair back from my face like I was a little kid. The baby was in the nursery down the hall because I couldn't hold her right then. I felt like a bad mother already. Tom called an hour later. They found Jessica's key in her purse that security had taken. She had a key to our front door that I gave her months ago for emergencies. Tom was getting the locks changed right now. The detective was taking pictures of everything in the nursery. Everything Jessica touched was treated like evidence. Our home felt like a crime scene. Tom's voice sounded tired and angry and scared all at once. He said he'd be back as soon as the locksmith finished. He said he loved me. He hung up. Linda squeezed my hand. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about Jessica standing in my baby's room planning to take her. The hospital social worker came in while Linda was getting me water. She had a folder and a kind face. She sat down and explained that Jessica was taken to the psychiatric emergency room. They were doing an evaluation. She'd be held for at least 72 hours. They couldn't tell me anything else because of privacy laws. The social worker said she understood that was hard to hear. She said she knew I needed to know if my family was safe. She gave me pamphlets about restraining orders and victim services. She said someone from the police department would follow up in the next few days. She left the folder on the table next to my bed. Linda came back with the water and I drank it even though my hands were shaking too much and half of it spilled on my hospital gown. I wanted to know what was happening with Jessica. I wanted to know if she still thought my baby was hers. I wanted to know if 72 hours was enough time to fix whatever was broken in her brain. The social worker couldn't answer any of that. Nobody could. I asked the nurse to take my daughter to the nursery. My hands were shaking too hard to hold her, and every time I looked at her tiny face, I saw Jessica's hands reaching out. The nurse gave me this look that made me feel like the worst mother in the world. She probably thought I was rejecting my baby. She didn't say anything mean, but her eyes said enough. She wheeled the bassinet out, and I started crying so hard my incision hurt. Linda tried to comfort me, but I couldn't stop thinking about Jessica holding my daughter like she belonged to her. I was supposed to be happy right now. I was supposed to be counting fingers and toes and taking a million pictures. Instead, I was falling apart in a hospital bed while my baby slept down the hall without me. Tom came back a few hours later with a bag of my clothes and my toothbrush. He looked exhausted. His eyes were red and he kept rubbing his face. He told me he barely slept at all. He spent the whole night checking the new locks every hour. Jake stayed over at our house and they were planning to take shifts watching everything until we knew more about Jessica. Tom sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand. He smelled like coffee and fear. I could feel him shaking a little bit. We didn't talk much because there wasn't anything to say that would make this better. Our home didn't feel safe anymore. Our life didn't feel safe anymore. The lactation consultant came in the next morning to help me with breastfeeding. My milk was coming in and my chest hurt. The consultant was nice and patient, but I couldn't focus on what she was saying. She showed me how to position the baby and how to get a good latch, but my brain kept replaying Jessica's words. I kept thinking about how long she'd been living in this fake world where Tom loved her and my baby was supposed to be hers. The consultant noticed I wasn't listening. She asked if I was okay, and I lied and said I was just tired. She left some pamphlets about breastfeeding and told me to call if I needed help. After she left, I tried to pump, but nothing came out. The stress was killing my supply before I even really started. Detective Stevenson came back that afternoon. He had his folder again, and this time his face looked different, more serious. He sat down and pulled out his phone. He showed me photos from Jessica's apartment. The landlord let him in to document everything. I stared at the first photo and felt my whole body go cold. She had a nursery. A complete nursery with a white crib and a changing table and a rocking chair. The walls were painted pale yellow. There were stuffed animals arranged on shelves. My daughter's name was on the wall in wooden letters. Sheila. The name Tom and I picked together 3 months ago. The name we told Jessica when she asked. Detective Stevenson swiped to the next photo. My pregnancy photos were printed and framed on the dresser. Photos from my social media that I'd posted showing my growing belly. Photos of Tom and me at the ultrasound. She'd printed them and put them in nice frames like they were her family photos. The detective showed me another picture. A calendar on the wall marked with dates. Our due date circled in red. Doctor appointments that matched mine. And a date 3 weeks from now labeled custody transfer in Jessica's handwriting. The detective kept talking and showing me more evidence. He found receipts in her apartment. Jessica spent over $15,000 on baby stuff. Furniture and clothes and toys and bottles and diapers. She bought a car seat. She bought a stroller. She bought a minivan last month. A whole minivan for a baby that wasn't hers. The detective said she'd been planning this since before my daughter was born. She treated my pregnancy like I was a surrogate. Like we had some agreement where I'd carry the baby and then hand her over. The detective's voice got quieter when he explained that part. He said Jessica genuinely believed this was the plan. She spent thousands of dollars preparing for a life that only existed in her head. My blood pressure spiked while the detective was showing me everything. The monitor started beeping and a nurse rushed in. She checked my vitals and her face got all concerned. She told the detective he needed to leave so I could rest. The doctor came in after that and said I had to stay another day. My blood pressure wouldn't go down. She warned me that postpartum problems can get serious fast. The stress from everything with Jessica was making my body shut down. She increased my medication and told me I needed to stay calm. How was I supposed to stay calm when my former best friend had a nursery with my daughter's name on the wall? Linda and Tom's dad, Robert, showed up that evening. Linda hugged me for a long time without saying anything. Then she sat down and told us they wanted to stay with us for the first few weeks after I got discharged. Linda used to be a nurse before she retired. She said she could help with the baby and keep an eye on my surgical recovery while Tom dealt with all the legal stuff and security issues. Robert nodded and said they'd already cleared their schedules. They'd stay as long as we needed them. I started crying again because I felt so grateful and so broken at the same time. I should be able to take care of my own baby. I should be able to go home and feel safe. Instead, I needed my in-laws to move in like bodyguards. Detective Stevenson called Tom the next morning. Tom put him on speaker so I could hear. The psychiatric evaluator who examined Jessica contacted the detective with an update. Jessica was diagnosed with something called erotomania. The evaluator explained it was a delusional disorder where Jessica genuinely believed Tom pursued her and loved her. She wasn't faking it or lying on purpose. Her brain constructed a complete false reality that felt totally real to her. The evaluator said people with erotomania can't usually tell the difference between their delusions and actual memories. Jessica really thought those fake conversations happened. She really thought Tom told her he loved her. She really thought they had this whole relationship. The detective said this wasn't something that would just go away. Even with medication and therapy, erotomania was hard to treat. Jessica might never fully accept that none of it was real. I got discharged on the third day. Tom brought the car around and Linda helped me get dressed. Everything hurt. My incision pulled when I moved and my chest ached from trying to pump. The nurse wheeled me out with the baby in my arms and I felt like a fraud. I didn't feel like a mother. I felt like someone pretending to be a mother while the real mother was somewhere else planning to take her back. We drove home and I stared out the window at normal people doing normal things. Going to the grocery store and walking their dogs and living lives where their best friends weren't delusional stalkers. When we pulled into our driveway, I saw the new locks on the door. Shiny and silver and proof that our home wasn't safe anymore. Tom carried the car seat inside and I walked slowly because my incision hurt. Every room felt wrong. The living room where Jessica sat and drank coffee. The kitchen where she helped me meal prep. The nursery where she touched all my daughter's things. I kept checking closets and looking under beds like a little kid scared of monsters. Except my monster was real, and she used to be my best friend. Tom went to put something away in the guest room closet. I heard him make this weird noise and then he called my name. His voice sounded strange. I walked down the hall as fast as I could with my incision pulling. Tom was standing in the closet holding a journal. A purple leather journal that I'd never seen before. He opened it and his hands were shaking. The entries were all in Jessica's handwriting. Page after page describing her relationship with Tom. Conversations they never had. Dates they never went on. Intimate moments that only existed in her mind. She wrote about the first time Tom supposedly told her he loved her. She wrote about him crying in her arms about me. She wrote about planning their future together. Every single word was a fantasy, but she wrote it like she was documenting real memories. Tom's face went white as he flipped through the pages. There were dozens of entries. Months' worth of detailed delusions all hidden in our guest room closet where she must have left it during one of her visits. Tom kept flipping through the pages and his face got whiter with each one. The journal had everything. Times I left for doctor appointments written down with little notes next to them. My 8 o'clock prenatal visit on Tuesdays. My 2 o'clock checkup on Thursdays. She wrote what I wore to each appointment like she was watching me leave the house. She documented when Tom went to work every morning at 7:15. She tracked when he came home at 5:30. She noted the days he worked late and called them opportunities. The pregnancy symptoms section made me want to throw up. She wrote that my morning sickness meant I was weak. She said my swollen ankles proved I couldn't handle motherhood. She documented my fatigue and called it laziness. Every normal pregnancy symptom got twisted into evidence that I didn't deserve my baby. She wrote that she would be a better mother because she was healthier and stronger and more prepared. My stomach cramped hard and I felt wetness spreading across my shirt. I looked down and saw blood soaking through the fabric over my incision. The stress was making me bleed through the surgical site. I called for Linda and my voice came out shaky and scared. She rushed in and saw the blood and immediately helped me sit down on the bed. She got clean gauze from the bathroom and lifted my shirt to check the incision. The stitches were intact, but blood was seeping from the edges where the skin was trying to heal. Linda pressed fresh gauze against the wound and told me to breathe slowly. I started crying because Jessica had been planning this for months and I never noticed anything wrong. I trusted her around my home and my husband and my unborn baby. Linda changed the dressing while I sobbed about how Jessica bought a crib and picked out names and made plans to take my daughter. She kept saying soothing things, but I could see she was scared too. The bleeding slowed after 10 minutes, but Linda made me promise to call the doctor if it started again. Detective Stevenson called Tom's phone the next morning. Tom put it on speaker so I could hear while Linda held the baby in the other room. The detective said Jessica could be held beyond 72 hours if the psychiatric team decided she was dangerous. He was working with them to build a case for keeping her longer. They had the journal now as evidence. They had photos of the nursery she set up in her apartment. They had the receipts showing $15,000 spent on baby items. They had her detailed plans to take my child written in her own handwriting. The detective said this was enough to argue for extended involuntary commitment. He warned us that even with medication and treatment, erotomania was really hard to fix. Jessica might never fully accept that her whole relationship with Tom only existed in her head. Some people with this condition stayed delusional for years, even with the best care. The detective promised to update us as soon as the psychiatric hold was extended, or if Jessica was released. Tom thanked him and ended the call. We sat there not talking for a long time. I tried to breastfeed that afternoon because the lactation consultant said it would help with bonding. Linda brought the baby to me and left the room to give us privacy. I held my daughter and tried to get her to latch. She was fussing and I was fumbling, and then suddenly I couldn't breathe. My chest got tight and my hands started shaking. I kept seeing Jessica's face when she held my baby in the hospital. I kept hearing her say the baby should have been hers. My heart was racing, so fast I thought I might pass out. The baby started crying louder because she could feel my panic. I called for Linda and she came running. She took the baby from me and I doubled over trying to catch my breath. Linda sat next to me and talked me through breathing exercises until the panic attack passed. When I could finally speak, I told her I couldn't be alone with the baby without seeing Jessica trying to take her. Linda suggested pumping instead so other people could help with feedings while I worked through the trauma. I agreed, but felt like a complete failure. I was supposed to be a mother and I couldn't even feed my own daughter without falling apart. Tom spent the next 2 days installing security cameras around our house. He mounted them at every door and window. He set up the system so we could check the feeds from our phones. Jake came over to help research which security system was the best. They sat at the kitchen table comparing features and prices while I stayed in the bedroom. I could hear them talking about motion sensors and alert systems, but their voices sounded far away. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling, feeling completely numb. This was supposed to be the happiest time of my life. I was supposed to be enjoying my new baby and recovering from birth and planning our future as a family. Instead, I was hiding in my bedroom while my husband turned our home into a fortress. I couldn't connect to anything. Not to Tom or the baby or even to myself. I felt like I was watching my life happen to someone else. Linda knocked and brought me food, but I barely ate. She asked if I wanted to talk and I just shook my head. There was nothing to say that would make any of this better. Detective Stevenson called again 3 days later. The psychiatric hospital extended Jessica's hold to 2 weeks. They needed time to stabilize her on medication and adjust the dosage. The detective said this was good news because it meant the doctors agreed she was dangerous. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. Even with treatment, erotomania was one of the hardest delusional disorders to fix. Most people with this condition never fully accepted that their delusion wasn't real. They might stop talking about it or learn to hide their beliefs better, but deep down they still believed the false relationship happened. Jessica might take medication and go to therapy and say all the right things, but she could still believe Tom loved her, and the baby should be hers. The detective said we needed to be prepared for Jessica to be a long-term threat even after she got out of the hospital. We thanked him, and Tom immediately started researching restraining orders. The next afternoon, Tom's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. A woman's voice came through crying and apologizing. She said her name was Fiona Dougherty and she was Jessica's mother. Tom put her on speaker and gestured for me to listen. Fiona was sobbing so hard she could barely talk. She said she was so sorry for everything Jessica did. She explained that Jessica stopped taking her medication 6 months ago. The family didn't know Jessica had moved to our city. They didn't know she'd reconnected with me. They thought she was still living 2 states away near them. Fiona said if they'd known Jessica was off her medication and fixating on someone again, they would have intervened. She kept apologizing and saying this was her fault for not monitoring Jessica more closely. Tom asked how long Jessica had been sick, and Fiona went quiet for a moment before answering. Fiona's voice got steadier as she explained Jessica's history. She said Jessica was first hospitalized at 19 for a delusional episode involving her teaching assistant. Jessica became convinced they were in love, even though they'd only spoken a few times about coursework. She showed up at his apartment with engagement rings. She called his parents claiming to be his fiancé. She had to be committed for 6 weeks. The second time was at 23 with a coworker. Jessica believed they were having a secret affair even though he was married and had never been alone with her. She got fired after she tried to kiss him at a company party and screamed that he was lying when he was rejected her. The third time was the one Jake knew about with his roommate's boyfriend 2 years ago. Each episode followed the same pattern. Jessica fixated on a man she barely knew. She constructed an elaborate fantasy relationship. She became convinced it was real no matter how much evidence proved otherwise. Fiona said each delusion got more complex and lasted longer than the one before. I agreed to talk to Fiona on speakerphone with Tom and Linda in the room. I needed witnesses for whatever she was going to say. Fiona thanked me for listening and then described how Jessica's delusions evolved with each episode. The first time, it was just a romantic relationship in her mind. The second time, she planned a wedding. The third time, she researched getting pregnant to trap the man into staying with her. This time was different because Jessica didn't just fixate on a romantic relationship. She fixated on becoming a mother through me. She watched my pregnancy and decided my baby should be hers. She made plans to take my daughter like it was a completely normal and reasonable thing to do. Fiona said this was the most dangerous escalation yet, because Jessica wasn't just delusional about a relationship anymore. She was delusional about motherhood and family, and she'd built an entire fantasy life that included my child. The psychiatric team told Fiona that maternal delusions were especially resistant to treatment, because they tapped into deep biological drives. Fiona offered to pay for our security system and any legal fees we needed for restraining orders or court costs. She was crying again and saying she should have done more after Jessica moved. She should have checked in more often. She should have made sure Jessica stayed on medication. She promised that when Jessica got released, she wouldn't have access to money or transportation. The family would monitor her closely and make sure she couldn't contact us. But even as Fiona said all this, I knew they were just words. Jessica was an adult. Her family couldn't watch her every second. They couldn't force her to take medication if she didn't want to. They couldn't stop her from getting money or a car or finding ways to get to us if she was determined enough. Fiona's promises made her feel better, but they didn't make me feel safe. Tom thanked her and said we'd think about her offer. After he hung up, we all sat there knowing that Jessica being sick didn't mean we were protected from what she might do next. 2 weeks after coming home from the hospital, my body was healing, but my mind kept replaying Jessica's face when she reached for my daughter. The incision site stopped bleeding and I could walk without feeling like my insides would fall out, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw her hands adjusting the blanket like she was the mother. Tom found me a therapist named Camilla who worked with new mothers who'd been through scary situations. She came to our house twice a week because I couldn't leave the baby yet. Couldn't imagine taking her outside where Jessica might be watching from somewhere. Camilla had kind eyes and didn't push me to talk faster than I was ready. She sat in our living room while Linda held the baby in the kitchen and asked me what I was feeling. I told her about the guilt that sat heavy in my chest, how I kept thinking I should have noticed something was wrong with Jessica before it got this bad. I'd been her friend for years, and somehow missed that she was building a fantasy world where my husband loved her and my baby was supposed to be hers. Camilla wrote notes in her leather folder and then looked up at me with this calm expression. She reminded me that Jessica's sickness wasn't something I could have fixed or prevented. I was pregnant and vulnerable and focused on growing a healthy baby, not monitoring my friend's mental state for warning signs I wouldn't have recognized anyway. She said people with Jessica's condition were good at hiding their delusions from others, that the fantasy felt completely real to them, so they acted normal until something triggered them to reveal it. Her words helped a little but didn't erase the feeling that I'd failed to protect my family from someone I'd invited into our lives. Detective Stevenson called during my second week home to tell us Jessica was moved to a different facility. The psychiatric hospital could only keep her for 2 weeks unless she was charged with a crime, and since she hadn't actually hurt anyone or taken the baby, they had to transfer her somewhere for longer treatment. She was on medication now that was supposed to help with the delusions, but the detective said she still insisted Tom had loved her, even though she'd stopped claiming the baby was hers after days of therapy sessions. The treatment center was an hour away and had strict rules about contact with the outside world. Jessica was allowed supervised phone calls once she'd been stable for a week, and apparently she'd already tried to call me 3 times. I didn't answer, but she left voicemails that Tom listened to first to make sure they weren't threatening. He played one for me on speaker while we sat at the kitchen table. Jessica's voice sounded smaller than I remembered, almost childlike. She apologized for scaring me at the hospital and said she understood now that the baby was mine. But then she said Tom had led her on, and she'd just gotten confused about the timeline, that he'd given her signals she'd misread. She talked about how much she'd cared for him, and how hard it was to accept that he didn't feel the same way. The whole message made my skin crawl because even with medication and therapy, she couldn't fully accept that none of it had been real. She still believed something had happened between them, just not exactly what she'd thought. That inability to see reality even when doctors were helping her was more frightening than her screaming in the hospital had been. Detective Stevenson came to our house 3 weeks postpartum to help us file for a restraining order. He brought a stack of forms and spread them across our dining room table, explaining that we needed to document everything if we wanted legal protection. Tom had already printed out photos from Jessica's apartment that showed the nursery she'd built, the calendar with our family milestones marked, and the receipts for all the baby items she'd purchased. The detective added the journal they'd found in our guest room closet, the security footage from the hospital, and a written statement from Jake about Jessica's previous incident with his roommate's boyfriend. We spent hours going through every interaction I could remember with Jessica over the past 8 months. When she'd moved to our city claiming she had a job opportunity that never existed. How she'd volunteered to help set up the nursery and spent hours in our house touching everything. The way she'd asked detailed questions about Tom's schedule and our relationship. Every memory took on a sinister meaning now that I knew what she'd been planning. Detective Stevenson recorded it all in his neat handwriting and told us the restraining order process could take several weeks. We'd have to go to court and present evidence to a judge who would decide if Jessica was dangerous enough to warrant legal protection. The detective seemed confident we had a strong case, but warned us that restraining orders were just pieces of paper. They told Jessica she couldn't come near us but didn't physically prevent her from doing it if she decided to violate the order. The hardest part of the restraining order application was writing my victim impact statement. The form asked me to describe how Jessica's actions had affected my life and my family. I sat at my laptop for 2 days trying to find words that captured the violation of having someone plan to steal my child. I wrote about lying in the hospital bed bleeding from surgery while she held my newborn and claimed to be the better mother. I described finding the nursery in her apartment with my daughter's name on the wall and the calendar marking when she planned to take custody. I explained how I couldn't be alone with my baby without having panic attacks because I kept seeing Jessica's hands reaching for her. As I typed everything out in clear sentences that would be read by lawyers and judges, I started to understand how much actual danger we'd been in. Jessica hadn't just been delusional and sad. She'd made detailed plans and spent thousands of dollars preparing to take my daughter. She'd studied our routines and waited for the right moment. If she'd been slightly more organized, or if we hadn't had family members who could disprove her affair claims, she might have found a way to take my baby from the hospital or our home. The realization made me physically sick, and I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. Tom found me on the floor and held me while I cried about how close we'd come to losing everything. Tom took a month off work using his family leave to stay home with me and handle all the legal stuff. His boss was understanding and told him to take whatever time he needed. That family came first. But I worried about money because Tom's leave was only partially paid, and we had a new baby with all the expenses that came with her. We'd been saving for years to afford this child, and now Jessica's sickness was eating into those savings with lawyer fees and security system costs. More than the money, though, I hated that Jessica's delusion was stealing these early weeks that should have been about joy and bonding with our daughter. Instead of lying in bed doing skin-to-skin contact and learning her different cries, I was filling out legal forms and having panic attacks. Instead of Tom taking cute videos of the baby's first smiles, he was installing cameras and changing locks. Every moment we spent dealing with Jessica's aftermath was a moment we'd never get back with our newborn. Linda tried to help by taking over all the baby care I couldn't handle, but that made me feel like I was failing as a mother on top of everything else. I should have been the one soothing my daughter when she cried, not hiding in my bedroom trying to breathe through anxiety that made my chest hurt. At 6 weeks postpartum, I went back to my doctor for the standard checkup. She examined my incision site and said it was healing perfectly, that I was cleared for normal activities and could stop worrying about the surgical recovery. But when she asked how I was feeling emotionally, I started crying and couldn't stop. I told her about Jessica and the restraining order and how I couldn't sleep because I kept checking the windows for faces. I explained that I was having intrusive thoughts about someone breaking in and taking the baby, that I'd installed locks on the nursery door and slept with my phone in my hand in case I needed to call the police. My doctor listened carefully and then said what I was experiencing went beyond normal new mother anxiety. She referred me to a psychiatrist who specialized in postpartum mental health because she was worried I might be developing an anxiety disorder on top of the regular stress of new motherhood. The line between reasonable caution about Jessica and paranoid hypervigilance had blurred so much I couldn't tell the difference anymore. Was it normal to check the locks 15 times before bed, or was that my anxiety taking over? Was it reasonable to panic when someone knocked on the door, or was I overreacting? My doctor said the psychiatrist would help me figure out what was proportional response and what was trauma making me see danger everywhere. Jake started bringing dinner to our house twice a week without us asking. He'd show up with containers of food from restaurants or meals Linda had cooked, and he'd play with the baby while Tom and I went to our therapy sessions. Camilla had suggested we do couples counseling in addition to my individual sessions because Jessica's delusion had affected both of us differently. Tom was angry in a way I'd never seen him before, furious that someone had violated our family and made me scared in my own home. I was sad and guilty and anxious all at once, grieving the friendship I'd lost while also being terrified of the person Jessica had turned out to be. We needed help learning how to talk to each other about what had happened without either of us breaking down or shutting down. Jake felt guilty too, even though none of this was his fault. He kept apologizing for not warning us sooner about Jessica's history with his roommate, saying he should have told me when she moved to our city that she had a pattern of fixating on men. But how could he have known she'd fixate on motherhood this time instead of just romance? How could any of us have predicted she'd decide my baby should be hers? Camilla reminded us during one joint session that mental illness affected entire networks of people, not just the person who was sick. Jessica's delusion had rippled out and damaged all of us, and we were all learning how to heal from something none of us had caused or deserved. The restraining order hearing got scheduled for when the baby was 7 weeks old. We'd have to go to family court and present our evidence to a judge named Harold Wise, who would review everything and decide if Jessica posed an ongoing threat. Our lawyer explained that judges took these cases seriously when children were involved, especially babies, but we still needed to prove that Jessica was likely to try to contact us or harm us if she wasn't legally prohibited. The hearing date felt both too far away and too soon. Part of me wanted it over with so we'd have legal protection, but another part dreaded having to sit in a courtroom and relive everything while Jessica sat there listening. The lawyer said Jessica would probably attend with her own attorney, who would argue that she'd been compliant with treatment and didn't deserve such strict restrictions. They'd try to minimize what she'd done and paint it as a one-time breakdown, rather than a pattern of dangerous behavior. We needed to be prepared for Jessica to look normal and sympathetic, for her lawyer to make us seem like we were overreacting to a sick woman who'd made mistakes but wasn't actually dangerous. Tom practiced staying calm when he talked about what happened, keeping his anger controlled so he'd seem reasonable and measured to the judge. I practiced telling my story without crying, though Camilla said it was okay to show emotion as long as I could still get the words out. The lawyer prepared us for every possible argument Jessica's side might make, every way they might try to discredit our fears or suggest we were being vindictive rather than protective. The hearing happened on a cold Tuesday morning when the baby was 7 weeks old. Tom's parents came to watch her because I couldn't bring myself to have her in the same room as Jessica again. The courthouse smelled like floor cleaner and old wood, and my hands shook so badly Tom had to help me through the metal detector. We sat at a table with our lawyer while Jessica sat 20 feet away with her attorney and her mother. She looked smaller than I remembered, wearing a blue dress and her hair pulled back neatly. She didn't look like someone who'd spent weeks in psychiatric care. She looked normal, and that scared me more than anything because how could someone who looked so regular have done what she did? The judge came in and everyone stood, and then we sat back down and the proceedings started with Jessica's lawyer going first. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, and he spoke in this calm, reasonable voice about how Jessica had been fully cooperative with her treatment team. He said she was taking medication as prescribed and attending therapy 3 times per week. He talked about how she'd made mistakes but was working hard to understand them, and that she recognized the harm she'd caused. He asked the judge to consider a minimal restraining order that wouldn't prevent Jessica from living her life, or working, or going to the school. He made it sound like we were being cruel by asking for protection from someone who was just sick and trying to get better. Our lawyer stood up next, and I felt Tom squeeze my hand under the table. She opened with the journal, reading passages out loud in the quiet courtroom. Jessica's detailed fantasies about Tom, her observations about my daily schedule, her notes about how I wasn't good enough to be a mother. She showed the photos of the nursery Jessica had set up with my daughter's name on the wall. She presented the spending records showing $15,000 on baby items and a minivan purchased specifically to transport a child. Then Jake took the stand and explained about Jessica's previous incident with his roommate's boyfriend 2 years ago. He described how she'd shown up at their apartment with baby clothes even though that couple wasn't pregnant. He talked about the 3-week psychiatric hold and how Jessica's family had moved her across the state afterward. Judge Harold looked tired and serious as he listened. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and glasses that he kept adjusting while he read through the documents. He asked questions about Jessica's current treatment and whether her doctors believed she had real understanding of what had happened. He wanted to know if she still believed Tom had been in love with her or if the medication had helped her see reality. Jessica's lawyer said she understood now that Tom hadn't pursued her, but she still struggled with accepting that the entire relationship had only existed in her mind. The judge nodded slowly and made notes, and I could feel my heart beating so hard it hurt. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm and clear. He granted a 5-year restraining order requiring Jessica to stay at least 500 feet from me, Tom, our daughter, our home, and both our workplaces. He said that erotomania was known to be resistant to treatment, and that Jessica's pattern showed escalation from her previous incident. He said protecting a newborn infant had to be the priority, even if it meant significant restrictions on Jessica's movement. Jessica's face crumpled when he read the terms. She started crying quietly at first and then louder, saying she was punished for loving Tom. Her voice got higher and more desperate as she said we were keeping her from her destiny. Her lawyer put his hand on her arm trying to get her to stop, but she kept going. She said Tom had promised her a life together, and that we were all lying to protect his reputation. Her mother leaned over and wrapped her arms around her, but Jessica pushed her away. The judge's expression hardened, and he warned that any violation of the order would result in immediate arrest and possible criminal charges. He said Jessica needed to understand that this was serious, and that the court would not tolerate any contact with our family. Security moved closer to Jessica's table as she sobbed into her hands. We left through a side door while Jessica was still crying, and I felt this weird mix of relief and sadness. The friend I'd loved didn't exist anymore if she ever had. I kept thinking about all the times we'd laughed together and made plans and talked about our futures. Had she been sick the whole time, or had something broken in her brain more recently? I'd never know, and that hurt almost as much as the betrayal. Camilla's office had soft lighting and comfortable chairs that didn't squeak. I sat across from her 2 days after the hearing and tried to explain how empty I felt. Not scared anymore exactly, just hollow where the friendship used to be. She listened without interrupting and then said something that made me cry. She said I was grieving someone who had never truly existed, and that was a unique kind of loss. The Jessica in my memories was partially real, and partially a construction I'd built from what I wanted to see. The real Jessica had been struggling with delusions maybe for years, and I'd missed all the signs because I'd loved the version of her I thought I knew. Camilla said accepting that was part of healing, letting go of the friend I thought I had, and acknowledging that person was never fully there. We talked about how mental illness didn't erase the good memories, but it did recontextualize them. Those coffee dates and shopping trips and late-night phone calls had been real experiences, but Jessica's internal reality during them had been different from mine. She'd been building a fantasy world while I'd been living in the real one. Camilla helped me see that I could hold both truths at once. I could grieve the friendship and still maintain firm boundaries. I could have compassion for Jessica's illness and still protect my family. These things weren't contradictory, even though they felt like they were. By the time I left her office, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying something heavy and finally set it down. The baby turned 2 months old on a Wednesday, and Linda came over with supplies to teach me her grandmother's tricks for soothing. She showed me how to swaddle tighter than I'd been doing, and how to make this specific shushing sound that apparently all babies respond to. We spent the afternoon together while Tom was at work, and I found myself actually laughing when my daughter made this scrunched-up face during a diaper change. Linda caught me checking the window at one point, and gently redirected my attention back to the baby. She said I was doing better than I realized, and that becoming a mother while dealing with trauma was one of the hardest things a person could do. I looked at my daughter's tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and realized I'd stopped seeing Jessica's hands reaching for her. She was fully mine now in a way she hadn't been in those first terrible weeks. I still had moments of anxiety, but they were getting shorter and less intense. I could focus on her expressions and her sounds instead of constantly scanning for threats. That night after Linda left, I sat in the nursery rocking my daughter, and felt something close to peace. Not complete peace because the fear was still there under the surface, but enough peace to believe things might actually be okay. Tom went back to work the following Monday with the security system armed and his phone set to check in every 2 hours. The first day was hard for both of us. I kept texting him asking if everything was fine, and he kept calling between meetings to make sure we were safe at home. But we both knew we couldn't hide forever, or Jessica's delusion would still be controlling our lives even with her gone. We needed to rebuild normal routines and trust that the legal system would protect us. By Wednesday, the check-ins spread out to 3 times a day. By Friday, Tom stayed at work for a full 8 hours without rushing home early. It felt like progress even though it was exhausting. Every time the doorbell rang, I jumped. Every time a car drove slowly past our house, I watched until it disappeared. But I was learning to distinguish between reasonable caution and trauma-driven fear. Most cars were just neighbors. Most doorbells were just deliveries. The world wasn't as dangerous as my anxiety wanted me to believe. I found the support group through a flyer at my psychiatrist's office. It met Thursday evenings at a community center 3 miles from our house and focused specifically on mothers who'd experienced postpartum trauma. The first night, I almost didn't go because leaving the baby felt impossible even though Tom was home with her. But I forced myself to walk into that room with 8 other women sitting in a circle. They ranged from early 20s to mid-40s, and their stories were all different, but somehow the same. One woman's baby had spent 2 weeks in the NICU and she had panic attacks every time he coughed. Another had been in a car accident 3 days after giving birth and couldn't drive anymore without flashbacks. A third had a sister who'd tried to take custody claiming she was an unfit mother. We all had this look in our eyes like we'd seen something terrible and were still processing it. Hearing them talk helped me realize I wasn't crazy or weak. Traumatic births happened. Medical complications happened. Violated trust during the postpartum period happened more than anyone wanted to admit. These women understood in a way my other friends couldn't. They knew what it felt like to be terrified in your own home with a newborn depending on you. They knew the guilt of not bonding immediately because fear took up all the space where joy should be. By the end of that first meeting, I'd cried twice and exchanged numbers with 3 women. I went back every Thursday after that. Fiona started sending updates every 2 weeks like she'd promised at the hearing. The first email came when the baby was 9 weeks old. She wrote that Jessica was living in a supervised group home with 4 other women who had various mental health conditions. She attended intensive therapy 4 days a week and had started working part-time at a bookstore doing inventory and shelving. The medication was helping with the delusional thinking, but Jessica still struggled with accepting that her relationship with Tom had never existed. Her therapist said she'd moved from believing it was currently real to believing it had been real in the past, but Tom was now lying about it. That was progress, apparently, even though it still meant she couldn't fully accept reality. Fiona apologized again and said she was trying to balance supporting her daughter while respecting our need for safety. I didn't respond to the email, but I didn't delete it either. Knowing where Jessica was and what she was doing helped somehow. It made the threat feel more manageable and less like she could appear anywhere at any time. At 3 months postpartum, my psychiatrist reduced my medication after reviewing my sleep logs and anxiety tracking. I'd been sleeping 6-hour stretches most nights, and my panic attacks had decreased from daily to maybe twice a week. I was learning to tell the difference between reasonable safety awareness and trauma-driven hypervigilance. Checking the locks once before bed was reasonable. Checking them 6 times was hypervigilance. Looking out the window when a car slowed down was reasonable. Watching every car that drove past our house was hypervigilance. My brain was slowly recalibrating what normal caution looked like versus what fear looked like. The medication reduction scared me at first because what if I needed it to function? But my psychiatrist explained that the goal was always to use medication as a tool during crisis, and then reduce it as I developed other coping skills. Therapy and the support group and time were all helping me heal in ways pills couldn't. I was getting stronger even when it didn't feel like it. Tom and I packed the car on a Friday morning when the baby was 3.5 months old. Linda had called earlier in the week asking if we'd come for the weekend, and I said yes before my brain could come up with reasons to stay home. Tom loaded the diaper bag, the portable crib, and enough baby supplies for a week, even though we'd only be gone 2 nights. I sat in the passenger seat holding our daughter while he checked the locks on our house twice, then got in and started the engine. We didn't talk much on the drive to his parents' place 40 minutes away. I watched the trees pass and tried not to think about the last time I'd been in a car for more than 10 minutes, which was the ambulance ride to the hospital when my water broke early. The baby fell asleep before we hit the highway, and I kept checking her in the mirror Tom had attached to the back seat. His parents lived in a neighborhood with big yards and old trees, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and kids rode bikes in the street. Linda opened the door before we even knocked and pulled me into a hug that felt safe instead of scary. Tom's dad carried in our bags while Linda took the baby and cooed at her, and I realized this was the first time I'd been somewhere that didn't feel like Jessica could walk in at any moment. Their guest room had yellow walls and a window that looked out at their garden. Tom set up the portable crib while I unpacked our things, and when he tested the baby monitor, I didn't feel the usual spike of panic about not being able to see her every second. We had dinner at their kitchen table, and Linda made pot roast with potatoes, the same meal she'd brought to our house the week after I got home from the hospital. Tom's dad asked about work, and Tom talked about a project he was leading, sounding more relaxed than he had in months. I fed the baby while they cleared dishes, and Linda sat next to me asking if I needed anything, not hovering but present in a way that felt comforting instead of smothering. That night I slept better than I had since before the hospital. Something about being in a house that Jessica had never been in, where her delusion hadn't touched any of the furniture or walls, made my body relax in a way it couldn't at home. Tom noticed too because he pulled me close in the morning and whispered that my face looked different, less tight around the edges. We spent Saturday in their backyard while the baby had tummy time on a blanket. Linda brought out lemonade, and Tom's dad showed us the new flower beds he'd planted. I watched Tom throw a tennis ball for their dog, and realized our house could feel like this again. Jessica's presence in our home wasn't permanent. She'd been there, but she was gone now, and eventually the feeling of her would fade too. On Sunday before we left, Linda hugged me again and told me I was doing great, that she could see me getting stronger. The drive home felt different from the drive there. I wasn't scared of what we'd find when we opened the door. Our house was just our house, and Jessica's ghost was getting smaller every day. Fiona called on a Tuesday afternoon when I was folding laundry. I almost didn't answer because unknown numbers still made my heart race, but I recognized the area code from her previous emails. Her voice was careful, and she asked if it was okay to talk, giving me space to say no. I put her on speaker and kept folding while she explained that Jessica was moved to a different program. The group home she'd been in for the past 3 months was transitioning her to a less restricted setting because she'd made progress. Fiona's voice got tight when she said progress, like she wasn't sure if she believed it or just wanted to. Jessica had been taking her medication every day without fighting it. She'd been going to therapy 4 times a week and working at the bookstore without incident. Her delusions about Tom had decreased, though her therapist used words like decreased and diminished instead of gone. Fiona explained that Jessica now accepted Tom wasn't currently in love with her, which was different from accepting he'd never been in love with her. It was a step, but not the step I needed to feel safe. The therapist had warned that stress could trigger a relapse. Any major life change or emotional upset could send Jessica back into the delusion as a coping mechanism. Fiona apologized again for the 100th time, and I told her it was okay, even though it wasn't really okay. It was just the thing you say to a mother whose daughter is sick. She asked if she could keep sending updates, and I said yes because knowing where Jessica was felt better than not knowing. After we hung up, I sat with the laundry basket and thought about how Jessica was getting better in small ways, while I was getting better in small ways, and maybe that was all recovery ever was. Small improvements that added up over time if you were lucky, and nothing went wrong. At my next session with Camilla, I told her about Fiona's call. Camilla listened and asked how I felt about Jessica's progress, and I admitted I didn't know how to feel. Part of me wanted Jessica to get better because she was sick, and sick people deserve treatment. Part of me was angry that she got to take medication and go to therapy and work at a bookstore, like her delusion hadn't almost destroyed my family. Camilla nodded and said both things could be true, that I could want Jessica to heal while also being angry about what she did. She suggested I write Jessica a letter that I'd never send, just to get all the complicated feelings out of my head and onto paper. I wasn't sure about it, but Camilla said it wasn't about Jessica reading it. It was about me processing everything I hadn't been able to say. That night after the baby went to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. I started writing and couldn't stop. I wrote about how scared I was in the hospital when Jessica held my daughter. I wrote about the journal we found and how reading her fantasies made me feel sick. I wrote about the nursery she'd set up and the $15,000 she spent preparing to take my child. I wrote about our friendship before everything fell apart, the coffee dates and movie nights, and how she was the first person I told when I got pregnant. I wrote about feeling angry and betrayed and sad all at the same time. I wrote about how I missed my friend, but my friend had maybe never existed, just Jessica and her illness pretending to be someone safe. I wrote for an hour and filled 6 pages front and back. My hand cramped and my eyes burned, but I kept going until there was nothing left to say. When I finished, I folded the letter and put it in my nightstand drawer. Tom asked what I was writing, and I told him it was something Camilla suggested. He kissed my forehead and said he was proud of me for doing the work, even when it was hard. Reading the letter the next morning felt different from writing it. The words looked smaller on the page, less overwhelming than they felt in my head. I could see where my anger was justified, and where it was just pain looking for somewhere to go. Jessica's illness explained why she did what she did, but it didn't excuse the harm. I could acknowledge that her brain was malfunctioning while still maintaining that she wasn't safe to be around my family. I could grieve the friendship we had while accepting that friendship was built on a version of Jessica that couldn't exist without medication and intensive treatment. The letter helped me separate the person I knew from the illness that took over. I could feel sad for both of us without letting that sadness make me vulnerable to her again. Camilla had been right about this exercise. Putting everything on paper made it finite instead of this endless loop of thoughts that kept me awake at night. I didn't need to send it because Jessica wasn't owed my processing or my forgiveness. This letter was for me, and it did what it needed to do. Tom and I decided to baptize our daughter when she was 4 months old. We'd been talking about it since before she was born, but everything with Jessica had pushed it to the back of our minds. Linda helped us plan a small ceremony at their church with just immediate family. No big reception, no extended relatives, just the people who'd been there through everything and proved they could be trusted. The morning of the baptism, I dressed our daughter in the white gown Linda had saved from when Tom was a baby. She looked tiny and perfect, her dark hair starting to curl at the edges. Tom wore a suit, and I wore a blue dress that actually fit now that my body was starting to feel like mine again. The church was quiet and cool, just our small group in the front pews. The priest was kind and didn't ask why we wanted such a private ceremony. He blessed our daughter and poured water over her head while she blinked up at him looking confused. Linda cried and Tom's dad took photos. Jake stood as godfather and made a joke about teaching her to play basketball when she was older. I held my daughter afterward and felt something shift in my chest. She was fully mine now in a way that went beyond biology or legal rights. She was mine because I chose her and fought for her and refused to let anyone's delusion take her from me. The baptism felt like reclaiming something Jessica's illness had tried to steal, this joy of being a mother without fear attached to it. During the baptism, I looked down at my daughter in my arms and realized I wasn't seeing Jessica's hands anymore. For weeks after the hospital, I couldn't look at her without remembering Jessica holding her, adjusting her blanket like she had any right. But now when I looked at my daughter, I just saw my daughter. Her small fingers and the way she grabbed at my necklace. Her eyes that were starting to look more like Tom's. Her smell that was all baby shampoo and milk. Jessica's claim to her had evaporated, leaving only what was real and true. My daughter was mine and Tom's, born from my body and wanted before she even existed. No delusion could change that, and no amount of fantasy could make it different. I kissed her forehead during the ceremony and felt the last piece of Jessica's presence in my mind dissolve. She was gone from this, from us, from the sacred space we'd built around our family. Jake started bringing someone to family dinners a few weeks after the baptism. Her name was Sarah, and she worked as a teacher at an elementary school. She was funny and normal and clearly liked Jake without any weird intensity or hidden agenda. Watching them together reminded me that healthy relationships existed, that most people didn't experience what we went through with Jessica. They held hands under the table and made each other laugh, and it was so simple and uncomplicated. Linda asked Sarah about her students, and Tom's dad told embarrassing stories about Jake as a kid. I sat there feeding the baby and felt grateful that Jake had found someone good, someone whose brain worked the way it was supposed to. After dinner, Jake helped Tom with the dishes, and I heard them talking about Sarah, how Jake was taking things slow because he wanted to be sure. Tom said something about trusting your gut and knowing the difference between normal relationship nerves and actual red flags. It made me think about how trauma changes your perspective. We'd always be more cautious now, more aware of warning signs, but we couldn't let Jessica's illness make us afraid of everyone. Most people were safe. Most friendships were real. Jessica was an aberration, not a reflection of how the world usually worked. My final session with Camilla happened on a Thursday afternoon. We'd been meeting for almost 4 months, and she said I'd made enough progress that weekly sessions weren't necessary anymore. She'd be available if I needed her, but she thought I had the tools now to manage without regular appointments. We spent the session reviewing everything that had changed since that first week after the hospital. I'd learned to ask for help instead of trying to handle everything alone. I'd learned to set boundaries and stick to them even when it felt uncomfortable. I'd learned to process trauma while still functioning as a mother and wife. I'd learned the difference between reasonable caution and anxiety-driven fear. Camilla reminded me that healing wasn't linear, that I might have setbacks or hard days. But overall, I'd moved from a terrified new mother who couldn't look at her baby without seeing Jessica's hands to someone who could plan for the future and trust in good outcomes. She asked about my medication, and I told her the psychiatrist had reduced it again last week. The panic attacks were rare now, maybe once every 2 weeks instead of daily. I was sleeping better, and bonding with my daughter felt natural instead of forced. Camilla smiled and said she was proud of how hard I'd worked. We scheduled a follow-up for 3 months out just to check in, and I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. That night, Tom and I sat on the couch after the baby went to sleep. We were watching some show neither of us was really paying attention to, when Tom said something about how our daughter would need a sibling eventually. I looked at him and he was smiling, testing the waters to see if I could even think about being pregnant again. A few months ago, the idea would have sent me into a panic attack. But sitting there with Tom's arm around me and the baby monitor showing our daughter sleeping peacefully, I realized I could imagine it. Not now, not soon, but someday. The fact that I could consider future pregnancy meant I'd healed enough to believe in good outcomes again. I told Tom maybe in a year or two, after things felt more settled and I'd had time to just be a mother to one child without crisis attached. He kissed my temple and said there was no rush. He just wanted to know if it was something we could talk about. I said yes, we could talk about it, and that felt like the biggest sign of healing. I could plan for a future that included more children and more joy instead of just surviving each day. I ran into someone from my old book club at the grocery store. She asked about the baby and then asked about Jessica, saying she hadn't seen her in months. I had my response ready, the one I'd practiced with Camilla. I said Jessica was dealing with mental health issues and we weren't in contact anymore. The woman's face shifted to concern and she asked if Jessica was okay. I said she was getting treatment and left it at that. The woman nodded and said she hoped Jessica felt better soon, then asked about the baby's sleep schedule, and we talked about normal things for a few minutes before saying goodbye. Walking to my car, I felt relieved that I'd handled it without explaining everything. I didn't owe anyone the full story. Protecting my family's privacy was more important than satisfying someone's curiosity. Some people knew what happened because they were there at the hospital or involved in the legal proceedings. Everyone else just needed to know that Jessica and I weren't friends anymore, and it wasn't something I wanted to discuss. That boundary felt good and right, another sign that I'd learned how to protect myself and my family without apology. The baby started sleeping through the night at 4 months, and suddenly Tom and I had evenings again. We sat on the couch after she went down at 7, and for the first time in months, we just talked without someone needing something. Tom told me about work, and I told him about the new mom group I'd joined, and it felt normal in a way I'd almost forgotten. We ordered takeout and watched a movie all the way through without pausing. When Tom reached for my hand halfway through, I realized we'd both been changed by what happened with Jessica. We were more careful about who we let close to our family, but we also said I love you more often, and didn't take quiet moments for granted. Tom started coming home from work and kissing me first before even putting down his bag, like he needed to remind himself I was real and here and his. I caught him watching me feed the baby sometimes with this look on his face that I finally asked him about. He said he kept thinking about how close we came to losing everything, how Jessica could have hurt our daughter or destroyed our marriage if we hadn't had proof of Tom's whereabouts. We'd survived something terrible together, and it made us stronger, but it also left us with this awareness that good things are fragile and need protecting. Fiona's emails changed from every 2 weeks to once a month. Jessica was living in her own apartment now with a roommate from the treatment program. She worked full-time at a library and went to therapy every Wednesday. Fiona said Jessica had started dating someone she met at a coffee shop, and her therapist was watching carefully for signs that Jessica might create another false relationship in her head. The updates made me feel strange, like I was reading about someone I used to know who'd become a different person. Fiona always ended her emails the same way, thanking us for not pressing charges and saying she hoped someday we could all find peace. I never responded to the emails, but I didn't block them either. Knowing Jessica was stable and supervised felt important, like checking that a door was still locked. Tom asked once if I wanted Fiona to stop sending updates, and I said no. Not knowing felt worse than knowing, even when the knowing hurt. At 6 months postpartum, I stood in the nursery looking at boxes I'd been avoiding since the hospital. My maternity clothes that I'd finally grown out of, and the gifts from Jessica's baby shower that I couldn't bring myself to use. There was an expensive baby blanket she'd monogrammed, a mobile she'd picked out, onesies she'd bought in bulk because she said every baby needed options. I'd shoved it all in the closet after we got home from the hospital, unable to look at anything her hands had touched. But keeping it felt like letting her delusion live in my house, and my daughter deserved better than that. I packed everything into garbage bags and drove to the women's shelter downtown. The woman at the desk looked at the pile of brand new baby items and asked if I was sure, and I said yes. These things needed to go to someone who would use them with a clear heart. Walking back to my car, I felt lighter, like I'd finally finished cleaning up a mess I hadn't made. My daughter's room was truly ours now, filled only with things Tom and I had chosen together with love that wasn't twisted or sick. Tom came home from work on a Tuesday and found me on the living room floor with our daughter. She was trying so hard to roll over, getting her shoulders up and then flopping back down. I was laughing at her determined little face and cheering her on like she was running a marathon. Tom stood in the doorway for a minute just watching before I noticed him. He pulled out his phone and took a photo, and later that night he showed it to me. I looked at the picture and saw a mother on the floor in yoga pants and a stained shirt, hair in a messy bun, grinning at her baby like nothing else in the world mattered. I saw someone who'd survived something awful and come out whole on the other side. Our family was safe, our home belonged to us, and Jessica's sickness didn't get to define what motherhood meant for me. I'd always be more careful now about who I trusted, always be aware that mental illness could hide behind a friendly face. But I refused to let fear and caution take over my life. We were building something beautiful, the three of us, and every day I got to watch my daughter grow and change. Every night Tom came home and we sat together as a family. That was the best ending I could have hoped for, not because everything was perfect, but because we'd protected what mattered most, and we were still standing.